Hi, and welcome to ChemSafety's latest series of online webinars for 2021. My name is Chrissy and I am the consultant coordinator here at ChemSafety. And today we were talking about the very popular subject of the adoption of the GHS classification system. Janet is our presenter today, and she is not only a compliance certifier, she is also a senior consultant and director of ChemSafety with over 18 years experience. As a recognised expert in the field of hazardous substance, Janet has been invited to speak and chair at numerous conferences and professional development sessions. If you're watching our webinar live, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen where you can post any questions, which Janet will answer at the end of the webinar. Our details will also be on the follow-up email, which will include a link to today's recording and also some online resources for you. So thanks for watching, and I will pass you over to Janet.
Thanks, Chrissy. Let's get this underway. So what we're going to be looking at today, as Chrissy said, is the adoption of the GHS classification system in New Zealand. So I'll be outlining what the GHS is, what changes are being made to the classification system, and what that means for our regulations and what you need to do and when you need to do it. So the first question is, what is the GHS? Or indeed, the first question is, why is my slide not changing? There we go. So the GHS is the globally harmonised system of classification and labelling of chemicals, shortened to GHS. It's an internationally agreed system developed by the United Nations, and it classifies chemicals based on their physical, health and environmental hazards. And it also provides the framework for communicating the hazards through labelling and safety data sheets. The GHS was first published in 2003, so 18 years ago, and has been revised every 2 years since then. The GHS has been adopted by more than 60 countries, including all of our major trading partners. While the most recent edition is the 8th edition, we are adopting the 7th edition, and this is in line with what the majority of our partners are doing. The EU, America, Australia are either currently in GHS 7 or are moving towards adopting GHS 7. The HSNO classification system that we've been using since 2001 was based on a pre-publication version of the GHS. So there are lots of similarities, but they've just drifted apart over the last 20 years. And so this is why EPA has decided to adopt GHS wholeheartedly and fully so that we are in line with our international partners. So there are some differences between GHS and HSNO. So the GHS as a framework only covers the classifications and labelling of hazardous substances. Regulations around packaging, storing, handling, using hazardous substances are all covered by local regulations, and local I mean by different countries. So in New Zealand, it's the EPA notices and our hazardous substance regulations that govern the use of hazardous substances. Our New Zealand regulations hang off the classifications that we give the substances. So if we've classified something as being flammable and corrosive, then there are particular controls that our regulations have based on those. So they hang off the framework of the classifications. Our hazardous substance regulations are not part of the GHS. The main difference we're going to see with this introduction is the nomenclature around the classifications. So HSNO has a shorthand around the classifications. You'll be familiar with a 3.1b and a 6.7b and a 9.1a, those shorthand classifications. The GHS classifications are descriptive. So it would be acute toxicity, inhalation, category 2 is the classification, which under HSNO was 6.1b. So that's where a lot of us have been reluctant to move to GHS because we love our shorthand HSNO system. People not familiar with it will find GHS much more useful because it is descriptive. There are some differences in the classifications themselves. HSNO was based on the GHS, so there is a lot of alignment, but we're looking at what the alignments and the differences are very shortly. Internationally, there is still some variation in the GHS, in the GHS implementation. So the GHS has some building block aspects of it, and we'll see when we go through the framework as to there are some parts that New Zealand has not adopted in the GHS. And so there are some differences there in different countries, and different countries can also have the option of using different cutoffs for mixtures. We'll see examples of that later. And some jurisdictions also apply the building blocks or indeed the GHF differently for different sectors. So consumer and domestic versus industrial. In New Zealand, we apply the same classification regime to all hazardous substances, no matter where they are. Looking at the timeframes of this change, so the classification change comes into force on the 30th of April 2021. So that's in about 2 weeks' time. So at that time, the new classification notice comes into force. All of the approved substances to date with all the individual approvals will either be reissued, reassessed, or revoked, and we'll look at more about this later. But just to make very clear, if an approval is being revoked, it is being revoked because there is another approval that's applicable to the substance. So this process isn't making substances illegal or having their approvals revoked without a replacement. The EPA Importers and Manufacturers Notice, the Hazardous Property Controls Notice, and the Disposal Notice will all need to be complied with at this time as well. And there's some minor changes that we will talk about. And any substances from the 30th of April onwards that's got a new approval, a new individual approval, will need to comply with this from the point of time it's approved. Well, for everything else, there is a 4-year transition period for the controls around labelling, safety data sheets, and packaging. So April 2025 is when you need to have your labelled safety data sheets updated with the new classification information and the GHS information there. And then the other major body of work around hazardous substances is the Health and Safety at Work Hazardous Substance Regulations. And so these refer to our substances by the HSNO classifications. And there is a 5-year deadline in legislation for those regulations to be updated to refer to GHS classes. So there's a few timeframes to look at there. The EPA website has several pages about the new hazard classification system. So a lot of good information on there. It's where you can find all the new notices, the group standards, the information about the fate of the approved substances and other details there. So the EPA website has a dedicated page for the new hazard classification system. Right, let's have a look at the classifications themselves. As I said, the HSNO classes were based on an early version of GHS, so we will see in many cases a one-to-one correlation. There are a couple of places where they don't, and I'll go into those in a bit more detail. The classification notice has a table of correlations at the back of it. So there'll be a lot of legislation and other documents that still refer to the HSNO classes. And so this correlation table is providing the equivalence that you read. So if you are reading the hazardous substance regulations and it says you need a certified handler for a class 6.1b, then you would read that as an acute toxicity category 1. So we follow this correlation table. We at ChemSafety have produced a 1-page version of these correlations to help us see exactly what's happening with the classifications. And it's this document that I'll be going through for the next few slides to look at what's changing in these classifications. This chart will be emailed out after the webinar. And I also just want to note at this point that we are not including class 1 explosives in this webinar. There have been a couple of minor changes around the classification of explosives, but it's not something that I deal with in detail. And we'll start at start. Flammable gases. So where there's a wee star showing, there's something new, and the wee magnifying glass tells us that we need to look a wee bit more closer and more closely at what's happening here. There'll also be a cross that comes up later where things haven't been adopted. So class 2.1.1a flammable gases have been split. First, they've been split into category 1A and 1B. And if there is no data available to you on the lower flammability limit or the fundamental burning velocity for the gas, you would categorize it as 1A. So if you don't know whether it's a 1A or a 1B, we'll assume it's a 1A. 1As have been further broken up into pyrophoric gases. So these are gases that ignite spontaneously, such as phosphine, and also chemically unstable gases. So gases that can react explosively in the absence of air or oxygen. And acetylene is an unstable gas, and so that would be classified as a flammable gas, category 1A, chemically unstable gas, and it's an A there as well. Class 2.1.1b aligns exactly with flammable gas category 2. We've also introduced new categories for the classification of the physical state of gases. So this includes those gases that don't have any other hazard classifications. So like nitrogen, it makes up 80% of the air around us. It's not poisonous, it's not flammable, it's not corrosive. But it is a gas under pressure, so there's an inherent hazard with that when it's packaged. A particular gas might be packaged in different ways. So with nitrogen, you might get a cylinder of compressed nitrogen that might be used in fabrication, or you might get a jar of refrigerated liquefied nitrogen if you're doing cool research with liquid nitrogen. So the classification for the gases under pressure does depend on exactly how that gas has been packaged. Aerosols is the area that probably has the biggest change. So HSNO only had one classification for flammable aerosols, 2.1.2a. It was an aerosol was classified as a 2.1.2a flammable aerosol if it contained 45% or more flammable ingredients. So whether that was the main ingredient or the propellant, if it was more than 45%, it was classed as a flammable aerosol. Under GHS, we've got 3 categories of aerosols. Category 3 are non-flammable. So there was not previously a category classification for non-flammable aerosols, so there is now. And an aerosol will be non-flammable if it's got less than or equal to 1% of flammable components. So anything more than 1% of flammable components now needs to be assessed to see whether it's a category 1 or category 2 aerosol. And as you'll appreciate, there's a huge difference between a 1% cutoff and a 45% cutoff there. So that's where people who are manufacturing and importing aerosols that have flammable ingredients between 1 and 45% will now find that there's an additional flammable aerosol classification that needs to be applied. Whether it's category 1 or category 2 does depend on test data. So if you don't have the relevant test data, it would be assigned to category 1. And the test data includes the heat combustion, and there's also spray tests and foam tests depending on what sort of aerosol it is. There's quite a flow chart in the GHS for how you categorize an aerosol to 1 or 2. If you don't have that data, it's category 1. Moving on to flammable liquids, nice and simple. There's a 1-to-1 correlation between flammable liquids A, B, C and categories 1, 2, 3, 4. Really simple. I like it. Unlike desensitized explosives. Now, there's not a lot of desensitized explosives out there, but this is one of the areas where there is not a 1-to-1 correlation between the HSNO classifications and the desensitized explosive GHS classifications. So the HSNO classes for desensitized explosives were based on the UN Transport of Dangerous Goods list of desensitized explosives. So under the transport requirements or regulations, there's a list of desensitized explosives that are allocated to packing groups, and that aligns with the HSNO class. The GHS has introduced a set of criteria for classifying explosives. So there's actually data that you would use to figure out which category they go into. But they don't correlate to each other necessarily because the UN data lists were not based on data. EPA have completed a very big body of work in translating the current approved substances classes under HSNO to the GHS classes. And so I'll just show you an example of that in relation to the desensitized explosives. So by filtering the spreadsheet that's on the EPA website, just to include the desensitized explosives, we'll see that we've got the name of the substance, what its approval number is, what its HSNO classes were, the approvals are being reissued, and over this side they have assigned the desensitized explosive or flammable solid category that it fits into as far as EPA have been able to tell based on the available data. There's not a lot of them. These are the only desensitized explosives in that spreadsheet. The rest of our class 4 flammable solids, again, nice correlation. Nothing really to talk about there. They just correlate really nicely. And similarly with the oxidizing substances and organic peroxides. The only difference is that with the class 5.1.1s, the oxidizing liquids and solids, the GHS classification includes whether or not it's a liquid or a solid. Right, this is where we start to see how some of those building blocks come into play. So for acute toxicity, things that you'd consider poisonous, if you have too much of it, it will kill you. There is a nice one-to-one correlation, but they've added in the route of exposure into that classification. So 6.1b, oral toxicity, category 2, aligns very nicely with the data that we've already got. We have not adopted the acute toxicity category 5. So this is the first thing that's no longer going to be classified as a hazardous substance. So anything that was a 6.1e for acute toxicity will no longer be a hazardous substance if that was its only class. The 6.1e classification under HSNO also did duty for looking at the aspiration hazards and the respiratory tract irritant hazard. So those are being carried through to GHS. We're only adopting category 1 for aspiration hazard. The aspiration hazard is when the liquid can get into your lungs and cause harm or be fatal. And then our 6.1e respiratory tract irritant has this beautiful simple classification: specific target organ toxicity, single exposure, category 3, respiratory tract irritation. This is the bit that we don't like so much about the GHS, about how long it takes to say this. With our sensitizers, we've got they align again, the 6.1a, 6.5a and b align with the category 1. There is available as an option some subcategories for these if there's some really strong, robust data about it. So this will be applicable particularly if you are making products and with low concentrations as to whether or not that classification carries through. So it would only be a smaller group of people that would be, this would be applicable to, but there is some options around the sensitization categories there. Skin corrosion and metal corrosion here, nice correlation. We are not adopting 6.3b, mild skin irritation. So again, if something's only class was a 6.3b, it will no longer be classed as a hazardous substance. There's a subcategory, we haven't broken down the eye irritation into subcategories either. I just wanted to point out something here around skin corrosion. We often come across people who've identified their corrosive substances as an 8.2a, and that's a byproduct of the hazard statements that come with GHS. So category 1A, 1B and 1C skin corrosion all have the same hazard statement: causes severe skin burns and eye damage. So if you're looking at the safety data sheet for your product that's come from overseas and all you see on it is that hazard statement that it causes severe skin burns and eye damage, that's not enough information to determine which category it is, and it makes a real difference if it's a category 1A versus a 1C in the controls that come on the regulations. So hopefully with this change to GHS, we will see more straightforward what the proper category is for skin corrosion. A one-to-one correlation again for some of these chronic toxicities. There are optional subcategories that are part of the GHS building blocks that we are not adopting in New Zealand. The specific target organ toxicity, so things that cause damage to the nervous system or liver or kidney, those sorts of things, specific target organs. The categories have been broken down as to whether that effect comes from a single exposure or the effect would only come about after repeated long-term exposure to that substance. And we've also kept in there the category 3 for the narcotic effects. So we've got 2 category 3 under the specific target organ toxicity, the narcotic effect and the respiratory tract irritant. And then the last group of substances and the classifications are around the ecotoxicity, so harm in the environment. For acute aquatic environmental toxicity, we're only adopting category 1. So if it's a 9.1A causes short-term acute harm in the aquatic environment, it will maintain category 1. And then the chronic toxicity in the aquatic environment is through categories 1 through 4. And there's some good alignment there, but the EPA's recommendation around aquatic toxicity is to do data calculations for mixtures rather than just rely on the correlation there. The GHS does not have classifications around terrestrial ecotoxicity. So HSNO currently has the 9.2s, 9.3s, 9.4s. So we are introducing new classifications to bolt onto the side of GHS to classify things that are hazardous to soil organisms, hazardous to terrestrial vertebrates, and hazardous to terrestrial invertebrates. So insects and bees and all those good things. And we're also maintaining the category that's designed for biocidal action. So it might be a product that is designed to kill something, it's got biocidal action, but it doesn't have meet the criteria for any other classification. Because it's designed to cause harm, we do want to make sure those are captured. For this grouping of classes, they'll only apply to agrochemicals. So for substances where release into the environment is an expected activity for them, that's when we want to make sure we've got the right controls in place for those substances that can have harm in the environment. And there's one other GHS category that we're not adopting in New Zealand, and that is toxic to the ozone layer. So it's not being adopted as part of our HSNO system, as part of our hazardous substance management. We do have other legislation around protecting the ozone layer. So that is the question, the section on what the classification framework is going to look like. I'll just see if there's any particular questions that have come up at this stage. So there was a question about if gases under pressure are now classified, does it mean that the hazardous substance regulations will now apply to them? They do anyway at the moment. So there's a part of the hazardous substance regulations, and I want to say part 15, which are the compressed gas part of it. And so that really applies to making sure that they're packaged in appropriate cylinders there. So the additional controls won't come into place because they don't have hazardous properties. It's all about the physical infrastructure of the cylinder. A question about the hazardous substance toolbox calculator and whether that will be updated. Yes, WorkSafe are working on updating that. And I imagine that it probably will include both classifications. I'm not sure, because as you've recognised there, we will need to know both systems for a period of time. And a question about whether there are significant differences between GHS 7 and 8. There aren't significant differences there, and countries don't tend to adopt each one as they come live. So I'm not sure what the gap has been between, say, what Australia has adopted before it was in version 7 there. it's a big body of work. It's taken us 20 years to change our system there. So it's not something that's going to happen regularly. And also the GHS has now been in place for 18 years. So the need for changes should be less. And I'll have a look at some of the pictograms that come up later there. But the question about pictograms coming up, we'd still use the same ones that we do, and they'll see some examples for that. So thank you so much for those questions. I'll look at some more later on. And just go back. Sorry, my slides disappeared on me. Okay, so what I'm going to look now is the approvals and classifying substances. So this is mostly relevant if you're involved in manufacturing or importing hazardous substances, or you might have a deeper interest in how the substances are approved and classified. EPA encourage you to look at the approvals that you have done, if you've done any self-assignment under group standard, and make sure that they are being done according to GHS 7. So all hazardous substances in New Zealand must have an approval. They're approved for use in New Zealand. There are a few mechanisms at play here. So some substances will have an individual approval. So things like pesticides and the highly hazardous substances must have an individual approval for that substance. And if you can remember back to 2004, 2006, when HSNO started, Irma, as it was then, they transferred thousands of substances into the HSNO regime and assigned them classifications there. So those all had individual approvals from that transfer process. And then there's the introduction of the group standard mechanism for approving substances. So this is grouping substances based on how they're used, such as a cleaning product, and the key hazard, corrosive. So there's a cleaning products corrosive group standard. And if your product fits the scope of that group standard, then that's the approval that it has. So as part of this transition for GHS, EPA has looked at the number of approved substances, and there's about 9,000 of them, and recognised that many of the ones that were transferred to HSNO early on would be covered by a group standard now. So that there's no need to have a duplication of an individual approval and a group standard approval. So they are culling those. So this is where that classification and fates list that I showed before with the desensitized explosive comes in. So they are reissuing approvals, where they're for individual ones that need them, or for really common substances like petrol is maintaining its individual approval. It's a fuel and it's really flammable, so it wouldn't fit into a group standard anyway. They are revoking the approval of about 5,000 substances. So that will be cutting out a lot of things because there is a group standard that is suitable. And so the example that's highlighted there is there was an individual approval for methylated spirits. But since that approval was put in place initially, there is a group standard specifically to cover that, the denatured ethanol group standard. And so in the spreadsheet, where they are revoking an approval, they have suggested or proposed a group standard. Now, you'll need to look at your product because there might be something that's more applicable based on how it's used there. The CCID, the Chemical Classification Information Database, will be updated. If you are looking at assigning products to a group standard, looking at the approval there, determining the classification, the EPA guide, the blue book, assigning a product to a HSNO approval, is being updated. So this will be replaced with an EPA guide to the classification of hazardous substances in New Zealand, and their intention is to have that available really soon after the 30th of April, so that will be probably one of the first pieces of guidance that comes out from them. There are some cutoff values that if you are doing classifications, you might be familiar with around when you include, when a class carries on into the mixture that it goes through. We have adopted, there's a lower option in the GHS for that, and that matches with what we've been using already under HSNO. So there's not any changes to these cutoff values that we use. There is a difference internationally between these cutoffs. So what we're doing aligns with what USA and Canada do and what we've done previously, but EU and Australia are slightly different. So there could be some minor cases where you get some slight differences coming through from substances that have been classified in the EU and Australia. There are alternative compliance provisions that we'll look at that mean we don't need to worry too much about that from a labelling and safety data sheet point of view. I'm going to briefly look at the changes to the EPA notices. So we've seen that these have been reissued. Aside from the classification changes, there's really been only a few minor corrections to them. So the ones that come into force on 30th of April, the classification one, that's the big one, that's completely changed. For the disposal one, they've obviously updated the terminology to GHS 7. There's been some tweaks around wording for packaging and containers. They've made it clear that if the only hazard from your substance is an eye or skin irritant, then dilution is an acceptable way of disposing of it. And there's been some changes around the definitions for bioaccumulative and rapidly degradable substances. And the hazardous property controls notice, so this is the notice that covers the controls for ecotoxic substances and also the controls for hazardous substances not in the workplace. So we've updated the terminology. There's been a change in terminology from pesticide to agrochemicals, which is just sort of broadening some of the substances that get included in that. And they've added in some of the controls that are needed around these terrestrial ecotoxic substances. And there's only been a slight change in the terminology in the importers and manufacturers notice. The notices that are transitional until April 2025, labelling safety starter sheets and packaging. So they've all been updated with the new classification terminology. They all have the transitional provisions included in them that we've got until April 2025 to comply. And then there's also been that update of terminology between pesticides and agrochemicals there. So the substance of these notices is not changing. All of the group standards have been reissued, and so these are available now to have a look at. So what's changed there is the name has changed so that we're losing references to the HSNO classes. The description of the classes as to what fits in the scope of the group standard has been updated. The approval number has not changed. So if you're looking at the records that you've got of the approval number of your substance, none of the approval numbers have changed. So you don't need to worry about trying to see what's changed to where you can follow that approval number through the information that's available. There have been some minor changes and corrections made to those group standards, and there's more information on the EPA website about those ones in particular. I'm going to move on now to looking at what's needed with labelling and safety data sheets. It is the other major component of the GHS, and the GHS is aimed at enabling labels to be used internationally so that they don't need to be changed to different countries' rules. It's the whole point of the GHS. The current EPA notices for labelling and safety data sheets already use the GHS framework. So many of the safety data sheets and labels will already comply with this. I won't say all because there was a transition period in place for the 2017 notices, and that transition period is still running. So if you'd put off updating your labelling and safety data sheets when the regulations changed in 2017, you've almost got another new extension now, but don't put it off forever. The hazardous substance regulations also refer to the pictograms and hazard statements from the GHS and the labelling and signage requirements that come through in those regulations. So the document that we're probably using at the moment when you're looking at what information is needed on your labels and safety data sheets is this labelling of hazardous substances publication that was based on a 2005 edition with the GHS. EPA will be updating this. but it's not one of the publications that's going to be available immediately when the GHS classifications come into force at the end of the month, but it is something that they will be updating. So the information that you'd be looking at to include on your labels and safety data sheets is the classifications. So obviously, this document refers to the HSNO classification. The pictograms, so you've got your transport one and your GHS pictogram. It's always, I think, good practice that if there is a DG, a dangerous goods pictogram available, to use that, as it's more informative than the GHS one. So if you've got a choice of using a dangerous goods or a GHS pictogram, I would always go towards using the dangerous goods one, as I say, it's more informative. We've got signal words, we've got hazard statements, and we've got precautionary statements, which all form part of the information we need. You often see some of these hazard statement codes appearing on safety data sheets, and they really shouldn't do that. That hazard statement code H223 should just be used as a cross-reference for getting the statement that's actually needed. So this is the information we have at the moment in this labelling guide. Until the new EPA document comes out, you can refer directly to the GHS. And so the GHS is available at the UN website, and there are a couple of places in the GHS documents to get this labelling information that you want. So Annex 1 has the summary tables. For aerosols, hazard category 1, that shows the pictograms that should be used, whether the GHS or the transport one, the signal word and the hazard statements, and then those cross-reference hazard statement codes there. There's also Annex 3, which goes into a bit more detail. It's got all of the statements we need. So again, looking at aerosols, for the different categories, what the signal words, the hazard statements, and those response prevention precautionary statements are all available there. So the information, if you're wanting to go to GHS, is available in the GHS itself. I mentioned before that there are alternative compliance provisions. So in the labelling and safety data sheet notices now, so the 2017 versions of them have alternative compliance provisions. So if you've got a product coming from a specified jurisdiction, that is the EU, Australia, Canada, or United States, and the label or the safety data sheet meets the requirements of that jurisdiction, then you as the importer or supplier can make a record that you're relying on this alternative provision, and you'll just need to add some New Zealand information to it. So contact information, and on the safety data sheet, some of the approval information. But you don't need to change any of the GHS elements that's deemed that it's coming from somewhere that's already using GHS. What's not changing now? So there have been a few minor changes to the EPA notices. The hazardous substance regulations will continue to refer to the HSNO classifications until the regulations are updated. So as we said before, we're going to need to keep both of them in mind for a period of time. The Health and Safety at Work Act itself has got hardwired into it a 5-year period by which the regulations need to be updated, and MB have got this in their planned body of work that they need to do sometime in the next 5 years. And the same would apply to other regulations that refer to hazard classes, like the major hazard facility ones. So what do you need to do? So new approvals must comply with the new notices from the 30th of April. And everyone needs to comply with the updated notices around imported and manufacturers of hazardous properties and disposal. If you are an importer or manufacturer of substances, then you need to check your approvals. And then by the April 2025, for all substances that have got approvals already and anything approved under a group standard, you need to make sure that the labels and safety data sheets and packaging all comply with the EPA notice. And it doesn't matter when the substance was first imported, it's based on when that approval was made. So if it's something that was approved under a group standard, that approval is pre-existing. So even if it's a new substance that fits under a group standard, there is that transition that applies. But do look at doing it sooner rather than later. So just looking back from the other perspective, if you're a supplier, importer or manufacturer, do check your approvals. Some of them won't be hazardous anymore. If the approval has been revoked, then you'll need to determine the appropriate group standard for it to sit under now for a new approval. And so you also need to then look at the GHS 7 classification, and the resources for that include the correlation tables and that FATES spreadsheet of what the EPA have assessed the approved substances to be at. You'll need to look at updating the safety data sheets if they don't already include GHS classification information, and you'll need to update your labels within that transition period. If you are using hazardous substances, then we need to get used to the new terminology. You might want to start incorporating GHS into your internal documents. When the review dates fall, I wouldn't make a huge priority to rush out and update everything next month when you've already got a schedule in place for things being reviewed. Pay attention to any communications you have from your suppliers, and you may want to have a look at what the approval status of your substances is, whether it's something that's been revoked or not, but that information will come through. As I say, when the approval's been revoked, it doesn't mean that the substance is no longer available. It just means that there'll be a group standard that needs to come to it. It's also a really good time to check how your current compliance with the hazardous substance regulations is. And in relation to safety data sheets, do make sure that you do obtain your safety data sheets from your supplier, whether that's directly from them or from their website or the New Zealand manufacturer's website. It's really important that you do get the safety data sheets that have the New Zealand information on it. They will have the approval information and the right contact details there. And I've had some questions put to me before the webinar, so I'll briefly go through those, look at the additional questions that we've got come through in the Q&A today, and we'll see how we get on. So one of the questions is, can I use overseas safety data sheets now? And the answer to that is yes, and you already can. So as long as they are in those specified jurisdictions and they meet the requirements of AGHS, so any of those additions is acceptable. What you need to add to that overseas safety data sheet is the New Zealand contact details, the HSNO approval information, and any applicable environmental exposure limit or tolerable exposure limit if one's been set. Those have mostly been set around pesticides. There's also a note in the SDS notice about other hazards. So, for example, if you've got something that releases a toxic gas when it's wet, that's a hazard category that's not part of the classification system, and it's a hazard that should be identified on the safety data sheet now. I've mentioned that not all GHS adoptions are equal, but that alternative compliance provision does apply. So if you are using an overseas label or GHS because it's in a specified jurisdiction, then you don't have to go around changing any of the GHS elements on it. And the hazard classification that you see on the overseas safety data sheet should match the EPA approval as well. There are some specific examples we've seen coming through where the classifications don't seem to match up, which is a little odd. Makes us think a bit, which is obviously good to be thinking about things. Another question we've had is around the transport classes, the DG classes for the transport of dangerous goods. There's no change happening around these. So all the requirements that you use for your DG declarations and packaging for transport of dangerous goods is not changing. We have produced a chart that shows how the dangerous goods classes align up with the HSNO classes and the GHS classes. And so this is another resource that we'll email it out to you after this webinar. You'll see just briefly from there that there's a lot of good alignment happening there. And I've answered this one already, but I'll just reiterate it. The CCID, the Chemical Classification Information Database, will be updated by EPA. The WorkSafe Hazardous Substance Calculator will be being updated by WorkSafe. Might not necessarily happen immediately, but those are definitely going to be updated. So I'll see the other questions that we've got. Will existing location compliance certificates remain as is, or will they have to be replaced? They'll remain as they are. There's no change needed for those. Will the date for updating the data on our site chemical schedules be aligned with the 2025 date? So this is looking at your requirements for inventory under the hazardous substance regulation. If you actually look at what's required on an inventory, it doesn't say that you have to include the hazard classification on that inventory. It's really useful if you do, but it's not one of the things that's mandated in the legislation about being there. But obviously, if you do have it, then you can work to do it. But in the meantime, having that correlation chart will help you enormously. Okay, a question that we are finding it difficult to source New Zealand valid safety data sheets for products that your sites have been imported directly from international companies. If you are importing something directly from overseas for use internally in your company, so you're not on selling it to anyone else, then there is a provision around that. Just having that international safety data sheet is okay. There's some particular clauses in the safety data sheet notice that allow for people who are importing for their own use to not have to write a new safety data sheet. There's a couple of bits of information that you need to compile, but you don't need to rewrite the safety data sheet. If you are importing for further supply within New Zealand, then it is your responsibility to provide a compliant safety data sheet or a cover sheet to go with the international safety data sheet. A question about the GHS pictogram red border is no longer used on labelling. I'd have to look at that in more detail. As far as I'm aware, that red border GHS pictogram is something that can still be used, but if there is a DG pictogram that's applicable to the class, then I would use that over the GHS one. And a question about segregation. So just to be clear, when it comes to segregation requirements, we should stick with the HSNO classifications and await any change in the regulations. Yes, so the regulations that refer to incompatibilities will still refer to the HSNO classes. We can continue using the classes for the purposes of those. Will WorkSafe be adding the GHS classification soon, so we can update as periodic reviews are conducted? I'm not sure what the time frame is for WorkSafe on their calculator, but you'll be able to use the correlation charts to get that information if you're wanting to update your information on site. Will the threshold tables and information be updated? So that will be, again, coming from the regulations, what needs a location certificate, what needs secondary containment. Those would be updated as part of a review of the regulations. So in the meantime, we just use the regulations as they are with the HSNO classes. And if you've got classification for a new product that only has GHS information in it, then you would use that correlation table in reverse to figure that out. Hazardous substance calculator will be updated, don't know when. And if we have signage on laboratories that use the HSNO and the transport DG symbols, should we update these to use GHS pictograms? As I said earlier, keeping the transport ones, if they're appropriate to the classes, is more informative. So I'd keep using the transport ones if they apply. And I've got something coming up in chat. Again, about the pictograms being used in the EU, okay for New Zealand. So again, the DG pictograms are international. If they're appropriate, use them, but then the GHS are what being used in the EU. So you would use those same ones again. And does Chem Safety offer any training on the classifications? Absolutely. More than happy to come out and do a session on site or to run a Q&A webinar and come out and do any sort of training that you're after there. Just give us a call. And I'll just give you a wee moment for any other questions to come through. Otherwise, thank you so much for participating today. It's really nice to have the interaction and the questions coming through. I'll reiterate that there's lots of information on the EPA website. And thank you so much for joining us.